A little over 2 months into his administration, President Joe Biden has predominantly stayed focused on his domestic agenda, particularly battling the COVID 19 pandemic, expanding the availability of a set of vaccines, and his $1.9 trillion rescue package. His personal foreign policy engagement has been studiedly minimal, but even within that, what stands out is his virtual summit with the leaders of India, Australia, and Japan, which, together with the United States, constitute a formidable alliance known as the Quad to counter China's growing global assertiveness.
Welcome Prime Minister Modi, Prime Minister Morrison, Prime Minister Suga to this historic Quad Leaders Summit. We'll begin with a short introductory video, followed by welcoming remarks from President Biden, followed then by Prime Minister Modi, Prime Minister Morrison, and finally Prime Minister Suga. And then we'll take a brief pause for the press to leave the room. And with that, the video.
Last Sunday, an earthquake and violent tsunamis struck the nations that surround the Indian Ocean, India, Japan, and Australia.
Forged from trial, united in a vision, free and open, inclusive and healthy, anchored by shared values, unconstrained by coercive power, and committed to addressing the world's defining challenges. A moment of crisis summons us with renewed purpose to end COVID-19, combat the threat of climate change, and lock arms in support of a secure and prosperous region, together with a commitment to democracy and in the spirit of cooperation. The Quad rises to new heights to secure a free and open Indo-Pacific for the region, our peoples, and the world.
Apart from that, there was a rather testy summit between Secretaries of State and Defense from the US side and their Chinese counterparts in Anchorage, Alaska last month, where both sides stated their positions clearly, Beijing doing so with remarkable vehemence. Watching this development along with others is former National Security Advisor and Ambassador to the United Nations John Bolton. In a special interview with Mayank Chhaya Reports, Ambassador John Bolton says the US side was unprepared for what has come to be known as the wolf warrior approach of the Chinese side, where they make finely targeted specific attacks, rebuttals, and criticisms of the country's many antagonists via a variety of Western social media platforms, as well as in direct diplomatic interactions. Mr. Bolton spoke to MCR about signs of a thaw in India and Pakistan relations, as well as China's $400 billion quarter-century-long agreement with Iran. Here is Ambassador John Bolton. Let me begin with, we are a little over 2 months into the Biden administration now. What stands out for you in terms of his foreign policy moves that you see?
During the campaign, Biden emphasized that he would focus on domestic issues in his first 100 days, obviously dealing with coronavirus and the economic consequences of it. And at his recent press conference, he continued to stress that even in the face of a large number of other domestic issues that members of the press asked him about. So it's no surprise that by and large, foreign policy has played a secondary role in the first couple of months. Now, there obviously have been some significant actions that he's taken, getting back into the Paris Climate Accords and that sort of thing, again, which were issues that he discussed during the campaign. So I think it's significant that of the few things that Biden has done in the first 2 months, the few high-profile things involving foreign affairs, that he took the time to have the first summit, albeit virtual, of the Quad: Japan, India, Australia, and the United States. Now, this was something that many of us worked on during the Trump administration. We felt that in light of the challenges that China posed in East and Southeast and South Asia, and really around the world, that the Quad, which had origins in various ways before that, nonetheless needed to play a larger role. And I think India and Japan and Australia in particular pushed very, very hard for that. We didn't quite get the reception from President Trump that we wanted. But in his final year in office, with the coronavirus posing the difficulty that it did, I think at lower levels of the government, a lot of progress is made. Now, I don't by that mean to understate the importance of Biden doing this first summit. And, it's important in a number of respects. Perhaps most significantly, it was a foreign policy issue that didn't deal with Europe.
Right.
So here is, when we talk about the free and open Indo-Pacific as a priority for the United States, that's a pretty graphic demonstration. Now, the first virtual summit didn't accomplish an awful lot, but I don't mind that. I think it's important that they established the channel, that they made it a precedent, that we can look forward to other meetings of it, and hopefully as coronavirus recedes, to get them together in person, which I think is clearly the best way to do this.
I'll take a slight detour and come back to the Quad summit in a bit. I want your take on the Anchorage meeting between Secretary Blinken and his Chinese vis-a-vis Yang Jiechi. Apparently, it was a pretty testy exchange, and on the U.S. side, they were told clearly to stop. Essentially to start respecting rules-based order that maintains global stability. On the Chinese side, they came back rather assertively. I was quite surprised when they said that stop advancing your democracy around the world. Now, coming from the Chinese, that's quite a strong statement. What do you think happened in Anchorage?
Well, again, I think the significance of this meeting is also important in terms of priorities for the United States as a whole, not just the Biden administration. But Blinken had joined Secretary of Defense Austin in a series of 2+2 meetings, as they call them, with their counterparts in Japan and then South Korea. So this is another bow toward Asia, two U.S. treaty allies, but not NATO, in the first physical trip to Asia. And I think significant that these two treaty allies were consulted before meeting with counterparts from China. So that's the way you do diplomacy. People may have forgotten about it during the Trump administration, but when you do the choreography, that's the way you do it. I thought Antony Blinken and Jake Sullivan were unprepared for what they received in public. I don't think they anticipated the real example of wolf warrior diplomacy that Yang Jiechi and Wang Yi displayed at the Anchorage meeting. And I think that was unfortunate. This was on American soil. You get the home court advantage. You get to arrange how this goes. I would have said, to the Chinese officials, you're our guest. Why don't you go first and see what they did, and then have a plan A and a plan B to respond to it. So in terms of PR, I don't think it worked out so well, and it showed maybe what happens when you've been out of office for 4 years and you come back in. The visiting team outplayed them. The real test is what was said in private, and I have to say, when the U.S. side's readout was that there were productive talks, I worry that the U.S. position was not presented as forcefully as it should be. This is only the opening encounter, but as the saying goes, you only get one chance to make a first impression. And I'm not sure that this was the impression we needed. We'll have to wait and see, but I don't think it went as well as it could have.
Purely at a superficial viewing, when one looks at America and China, perhaps the simplistic sense is that while the former is struggling, that is, America is struggling, if not in actual decline, the latter has risen with rather brazen self-assurance in recent years, even in the midst of the pandemic. What's your sense? How much do you think America should be concerned about the kind of wolf warrior approach that China is taking everywhere?
Yeah. Well, I think this is another example. I don't think you need too much more evidence to say that Deng Xiaoping's policy of hide your capabilities and bide your time, the hide and bide policy that China pursued for many years, that's a piece of history now. They're not hiding anything. They're very assertive, very confident, and not just in Asia but around the world. So I don't think there's any need for the United States now to hide its concern about what this means, not just in Asia but again globally. The Chinese economy has depended for many years on stealing intellectual property from other countries, discriminating against foreign investors and businesses, intervening in its economy, frustrating the rules of the World Trade Organization, and a whole variety of other things, so that we're in a period of increased tension and confrontation. I don't think there's any doubt about it. And I think that ranges across the spectrum, political, military, and economic. I think that attitudes toward China have changed around the world. I think there's public opinion data that shows that people see this as an increased and more threatening environment. And I think it's up to the United States and others who see it the same way to act accordingly. I actually think the wolf warrior diplomacy hurts China. I think with many small nations in the Indo-Pacific region, it's something that's very frightening to them. So I think there's a lot of room for improvement in American diplomacy as well. There's no question about it. I just note a small example, though, of how to do this. Recently, the president of Palau in the Pacific visited Taiwan. It's one of the few countries that still has formal diplomatic relations with Taiwan. But the president of Palau was accompanied by the U.S. ambassador to Palau, John Hennessy Nyland. So they both went to Taipei. A very rare example of a U.S. diplomat in recent years visiting Taiwan. I found it especially significant since years ago in the Bush 41 administration, John Hennessy Nyland worked for me at the International Organizations Bureau of the State Department. But I think it's the right thing to do. I think this is how the U.S. can show to the small countries that are concerned about wolf warrior diplomacy that we understand their concerns and want to work more closely with them and other friends like Taiwan.
Circling back to the Quad, contrary to misgivings in some quarters, President Biden, as you pointed out, has decided to sharpen the dynamic between the four countries. Do you think that's the right approach? I ask because I've personally thought that the idea that four nations have to gang up, as it were, against one, that is China, in a sense reinforces their sense of manifest destiny, don't you think?
Well, I don't know if it reinforces that or concerns at least some people in China that their policies turning out to be counterproductive. You know, the Quad is a very informal grouping. It doesn't imply anything at the high end of the cooperation spectrum, but I think it's useful, and I think it sends a signal, especially after the Trump administration, that the United States is not withdrawing from East and South Asia, that it intends to remain because it has significant interest there. It has key friends and allies there. And I think the Chinese need to know that the steps they've taken in a wide variety of areas have obviously not gone unnoticed, and they will not go unanswered.
Of the four, India obviously has most at stake because it's the only one with a long border and a long history of conflict and tensions. How do you see New Delhi balancing its neighborly compulsions with Beijing, with its geostrategic ambitions and obligations?
Well, you know, it's not something I envy that India has a long border with China. The fact is that China today is the remnant of a land empire. So is Russia, as an example. While we're on the subject, and the days of the big international empires based in Europe are gone. And people have considered that to be kind of natural evolution because their empires were so far across the sea. It's harder for some people to see that land empires are in a way just as unnatural as sea-based empires. And I think China and Russia are both trying to confront how to deal with this. The Chinese approach is to try and strengthen control not only over their hinterland, but over regions nearby. I think that's a large part of what the Belt and Road Initiative is. And I think that Beijing has especially looked at their longstanding ties with Pakistan as a way to try and increase their influence on the subcontinent, but also in other areas around India. Nothing is inevitable here, that's for sure. But I think China's long-range strategic thinking clearly sees only one hegemonic power in Asia, and they intend to be that power. So this is not something where anybody's looking for conflict. That's basic. That's very clear. But it's not the members of the Quad, not India or any of the rest, that are seeking conflict. It's China's actions that are putting the others at risk, have put the others at risk, particularly in the economic sphere, for many years. And it's perhaps we've all been a little bit late in awakening to it, but that awakening is happening now, and steps will follow from that.
One of the clearest examples of China's ambitions, especially in Asia, is the 400 billion 25-year long investment agreement it has signed with Iran. As part of that, over the next 25 years, it will invest that amount of money in exchange for uninterrupted supply of oil. Broadly, the deal has two objectives. One is domestic, and the other is to counter the US in the Middle East using Iran as its proxy. That's my sense. How do you see this playing out?
Well, it's hard at this point to see if it's more than propaganda. I mean, it's successful as a propaganda ploy. And the basic rationale for the deal is pretty clear. China has a huge demand for energy. It has inadequate domestic supplies. It needs a more reliable source of oil and natural gas in particular. Iran is a pariah country in the Middle East and really internationally. And so they, without many other options, each turns to the other. Now, whether this in fact materializes in terms of the capital investment in Iran's oil capacity, I think remains to be seen. Because as long as the U.S. sanctions continue, I think a lot of international firms are going to be very leery of having anything to do with this. And as tensions between the U.S. and other countries on the one hand and China on the other increase, I think that makes that play riskier as well. And that's one reason why I think the long-term interest of peace and security in the Middle East requires a different regime in Tehran. It's not just on the nuclear program, although that is the most concerning to many countries. It's also in the political and economic stability of the Middle East too. So we'll have to see how this plays out. I mean, big promises have been made for many years about extraordinarily large capital investments in Iran's oil assets that haven't played out. We just don't know at this point whether this will be another one in that long line.
I said, do you see China's inroads into Iran complicating the Biden administration's moves to sort of revive the nuclear deal?
Yeah, I think it does complicate it because one of the biggest differences between 2021 and 2015, when the Iran nuclear deal was agreed, was that in the Middle East itself, there have been dramatic changes. We have seen the oil-producing Arab nations, I think, become much more united in their concern about Iran's support for terrorism in the region, the Houthi rebels, the Hamas and Hezbollah terrorist groups, and Iran's conventional activity in Syria, in Iraq, and elsewhere. I think the Abraham Accords, the opening of diplomatic relations between Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates and Israel, I think more to come on that front, show that the basic national interest of the oil-producing Arab states in Israel are much more closely aligned in dealing with the Iranian threat. So this is a huge change from 70 years of history about basic strategic alignments in the Middle East. And so these countries now, not just Israel, but the Arabs as well, are much more united, I think, in opposing any resurgence of the 2015 nuclear deal with Iran, which they thought at the time was inadequate and potentially dangerous, and now see it even more so and can speak with a more unified voice to Washington and the European capitals.
Is that your sense that somewhere along the line there may have been rather egregious overestimation of the damage that Iran could do internationally? And in the process, you pushed it away. Why is this constant focus on demonizing a civilization, which is obviously a very rich civilization? And I can tell you it from some personal interactions that Iranians feel culturally offended when they are lectured to, because they say we have had a pretty long civilization. You go around lecturing us, it doesn't work for us. Why do you think Iran remains where it is internationally?
Well, look, almost everybody's had a longer civilization than the United States. We're a very young nation, so we're opinionated, I suppose, would be one way to look at it. But I don't think we're trying to criticize Iran as a civilization. We are very much concerned about one regime, the regime that's in power now. And it probably doesn't make everyone happy to remember back to when the Shah was still in power, when we had extraordinarily good relations with the government of Iran. So I don't, but I think the conclusion is this is not about the Iranian people or Iranian civilization. It's about the regime that threatens their neighbors in the Middle East, as well as the U.S. and others. And I don't think we push them away. I mean, look, it's called the Islamic Revolution of 1979. And one of the first things they did in 1979 was seize American diplomats as hostages. Before we had done anything, the diplomats were just sitting there in the embassy and were taken and released only after an extraordinarily difficult effort to get them out. So I think it was the revolution that took the first step, if anything. And they've got a long history going back to through a surrogate terrorist group in Lebanon bombing the Marine barracks in Beirut back in 1983. So they've killed Americans for a long time after that. But the real point here is that the threat that this government in Tehran poses, both for its support of international terrorism and for its pursuit of nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles, has made it a threat. And I think even our friends in Europe who want us to go back into the 2015 deal acknowledge, and in public, I think pretty clearly, that they understand that deal is inadequate and has a lot of flaws in it. So even they agree that much more needs to be done to restrain Iran. It's not like the U.S. is isolated on this score, quite the contrary.
How do you see the signs of sudden thaw in relations between India and Pakistan? Do you think the Biden administration is leaning on the two to get on with the talks, or it's just a natural order of things?
I have to say, I don't see any evidence the Biden administration has played any role one way or the other in what's been happening. And my understanding from afar is that it's more on the trade side. The warming, if that exists, is more on the trade side, which I think is understandable since you've got the interest on both sides of the border that would like to see trade resume or go back to something before the latest difficulty arose a couple of years ago over Kashmir. I would like to think that it's a secular trend toward better relations. I think from the U.S. point of view, that would be important. And I think because the U.S. has its own current difficulties with Pakistan over the issue of support for international terrorism and our concern for what's happening in Afghanistan and elsewhere, that steps by both India and Pakistan to resolve differences would help reduce tensions on the subcontinent. And I would have to say, from the U.S. point of view, help in a discussion with Pakistan on really whether it's in their best interest to get closer to China than they already are.
Yeah, I mean, I was coming to that in terms of the dynamic that plays out in that area. You have the Quad on one side supporting India. You have China on the other side supporting Pakistan. Given that, do you seriously think this issue is resolvable in the near term?
Well, I wouldn't look for sweetness and light to break out totally. That's for sure. And I think there are a lot of complicated questions involved here. Going basically to the question, the overall strategic question of how to deal with China. I mean, the India-Pakistan question is one that I think India has made it pretty clear from the outset that it has seen that as a bilateral matter and has politely refused all outside offers to help. And I think we understand that clearly. But there are other players involved here as well, and the China aspect of it, I think, is one that because it has much broader concerns than simply events on the subcontinent, as important as those are to both Pakistan and India for obvious reasons, there are a lot of other implications here too. So while it complicates things, there may also be an opportunity here that's worth exploring. And my hope is that as diplomacy within the Quad expands, that there are avenues that could be explored on that point. And I would say, it's let's think a little bit larger as well. When we look to the West, where the issue of Iran obviously arises, and the broader Middle East, there may be things here that Dwight Eisenhower always used to say: when you've got a problem that you can't solve, expand it. To look outside the confines of your previous analysis, and that thinking of the India-Pakistan dynamic, that may be something that we should explore further.
The last two questions. One is in terms of domestic U.S. affairs. How do you think the exit of President Trump has played out in so much as it concerns the insane volatility that you continue to see within the Republican Party? I mean, he continues to loom over, as evident in Georgia, the voting bill. What's your take on that?
Well, I think Trump's influence within the Republican Party is declining day by day. I mean, I think we all need to take a step back and realize that on the 20th of January, he went from sitting in the most powerful office in the world, the Oval Office, to sitting by the swimming pool at Mar-a-Lago. And it's just not the same. I think it's also a mistake to believe that Trump's support within the Republican Party is like a monolithic block of granite, that it's unmovable, unshakable, unbreakable, and that he'll have a lock on it forever. I don't think that's true. In fact, I'll be through my super PAC, I'll be doing some polling, I hope very soon, that tries to understand better what it is that motivates Trump's base, so that we can find ways for responsible politicians to appeal to the legitimate concerns of those voters. I think my prediction is that Trump will not run in 2024. He'll talk about it incessantly between now and then, but ultimately he won't run. And I think we'll have a very competitive race for the Republican nomination. I'm optimistic about our chances to take control of the House of Representatives in 2022. I think the Senate's a little bit tougher fight because we have more Senate seats to defend, but I think we've got a good shot there. So I think it's just important to keep the left wing of the Democratic Party from getting out of control, and I think that's a huge unifying factor for Republicans generally. So I don't underestimate the damage Trump has done to the party, to the country internationally, but I think it's repairable. I'm optimistic about that. I think we've got work to do, but I'm optimistic about the outcome.
Are you positioning yourself at all for the high office?
Look, no, at this point, I don't have any intention to do that. I do want to be helpful in setting the ship back on its an even keel and heading in the right direction. So I expect to be very involved in Republican politics, but at this point, no, I don't have aspirations for higher office, as they say.
How do you think President Biden is doing in terms of at least making some inroads into the so-called Trump base? Do you think he is resonating at all there yet?
Well, I think he has sustained in the first 2 months higher public opinion ratings than Trump ever did. And I think that is a sense, it's another example of what I'd call a reversion to the norm, that a new president does get a honeymoon, that people want the new president to succeed on behalf of the country as a whole. And I think you will see much of that in American diplomacy internationally. Not that I'm going to agree with Biden on an awful lot of what he does, but it's a return to the norm of a center left or maybe more left Democratic president. And in 2024, I hope we're going to return to the norm of a center right Republican president. The Trump era, I think, is an anomaly. I think Trump himself is an aberration. And the question for the U.S. is how quickly we can get over it.
And finally, since you had the perch as the NSA during the Trump administration, do you feel that ferment is the new normal in America? Because you see ferment across the board, be it anti-Asian violence, be it gun violence, the January 6th events. What do you think is going on? Is there some subterranean upheaval that's building up?
No, I don't think so at all. I mean, I think there's work to be done on racial divisions within the country. I don't deny that, but I think also it would be historically very inaccurate to deny the progress that's been made over the past 75 years since the end of World War II. It's not to deny that more is required, but a lot has been done. And I think part of this is just a general simmering down across the nation from 4 years of hyperactivity under Trump. We'll see which hypothesis turns out to be right, but I don't see fundamental weaknesses in the structure of American society. And I think coming out of the COVID pandemic, I think you're going to see a substantial economic improvement. I hope without inflation caused by excessive Democratic government spending, but I think we're going to have a big economic boost, and I think that'll be reflected in a greater sense of domestic tranquility.
On that note, I think I've wrapped up once again within my time limit, Ambassador Bolton. I'm truly grateful, and I'll send you the links to your staff. Thank you so much. You've been very kind.
Well, thank you very much for having me again. Have a good day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Okay, take care.
As an adjunct to that, I would like to offer brief excerpts from an interview that I had conducted with the Dalai Lama in his residence in McLeodganj in Himachal Pradesh, India, in the immediate aftermath of China then emerging as the world's second largest economy. That is to illustrate how much the world has changed in the last decade, even as China has become an even more decisive player in global affairs. This interview was done as part of gathering new material for my authorized biography of the Dalai Lama, first published in 2007 in America by Doubleday Random House. The interview formed an extensive part of the new material in the updated biography, now titled The Denoma, the 14th Dalai Lama's Life of Persistence. China now is officially the second largest economy in the world after it has overtaken Japan. What do you think are the consequences of this for Tibet? Do you think is it not in China's interest to resolve Tibet now, or you think it can muscle its way further still?
That's difficult to say. The one way the country or the government, you see, get more self-confidence, then they can handle the domestic problem more realistic way. If the whole sort of situation is a little bit sort of shaky, then sometimes more hesitant to handle some of the tricky issue. So from that viewpoint, the people from China now getting more stronger, is useful. It's maybe more positive sort of impact. Now obviously, last 60 years, when China remained isolated, till late 70, till 80, isolate. I think people there, because lack of knowledge, so I think they are thinking maybe more limited. After things are being open in the economy field, wider contact developed with outside world, so much number of Chinese now more
aware of this.
more open-minded, more liberal-minded, right? So therefore, now for example, last, I think now 2 years, we notice articles wrote by Chinese in Chinese language about 1,000 about Tibet, all very much supportive about our way of approach.
I see.
And criticized about government policy. In, I think 30, 40 years ago, impossible.
Yeah.
Now such things happen.
Yeah.
So like that. So, wait to see where. Difficult to say at the moment.